Inside the walls, Elizabeth slouched against the sealed door, gasping for breath. Faye set Don on the floor, and the mouse drew a clean knife to dig the bullet from his arm. Stu moaned aloud, patting his chest to calm his pounding heart. "This is it!"
The passage?
Elizabeth asked. Stu shook his head. "No, the big one!" He stretched out on his back and heaved a sigh. Elizabeth knelt beside the shrew and leaned an ear against his chest. "Oh, thank you, Elizabeth," Stu rasped, patting a small hand against her neck. "That's a nice send-off. Stay close to me, Elizabeth." Elizabeth, however, smirked and straightened up.
You're going to be fine, Stu. You're just coming off an adrenaline rush.
We all are,
Don mumbled, fastening a leather strap around his arm to stifle the bleeding.
and we'll have many more before the end, I'll bet.
Elizabeth scanned the hall, forward and behind, as she hauled Stu to his feet.
So, which way now?
Stu pointed ahead. "That way, I think."
If you're wrong, we're dead,
Don grumbled. Elizabeth gave him a cold look.
Well, it's better than staying put and getting caught by the patrols. And even if he's right, we might still die.
Chances are a lot higher if he's wrong.
Elizabeth ignored Don's remarks, instead giving Stu a light push under the shoulders.
Lead on.
Stu winced. "Can't we rest? Just for a bit?" Elizabeth nodded.
Of course. We'll rest when we get there.
Stu groaned, but obeyed. He remembered the route quite well, having traveled it twice before, and it wasn't long before the quartet was climbing a narrow stairway to a forbidding rat-sized door.
I don't like this.
Don remarked several times.
On the way in, we'd find traps around every corner. Then all of a sudden, nothing. It's like this place is the next trap.
Stu shook his head as the doorknob rattled in his grip. "No good. It's locked."
Let me at it.
Faye stepped forward, drawing a pin from her hair.
I've picked a few locks in my time.
The other three drew back, giving the door a wide, cautious berth as Faye rattled about in the keyhole. A moment later there was a telltale click as the door creaked ajar. Faye squeezed against the nearest wall and poked it open a bit further. She was answered only with stillness. As Faye peered around the corner, she found no tripwires, no pressure plates, not even a motion sensor waiting for her. What she did find, however, drew a yelp of alarm from her. Elizabeth and Don drew alongside the rat, while Stu crept up behind them. Before them stretched a towering hallway that had once doubled as a sitting room. The chairs and benches and couches that had once seated the rare visitor had been smashed and ripped, covering the floor with a thin white layer of stuffing. The walls were still hung with many paintings, but every canvas...
Bless you.
But every canvas had been shredded as if by a garbage disposal, leaving their last ragged remains to hang from the ornate frames.
Someone sure had a hissy fit,
Don remarked. What? Stu shoved his way to the front. "What did I miss?" His face paled as he laid eyes on the carnage within. "Well, ow-wee! Glad I wasn't here to see that happen."
I'm guessing our cyborg friend doesn't appreciate art,
Don announced. "Likes art just fine," Stu added. "He just wasn't a fan of this art."
We'll explain later.
Elizabeth added. A turn to the left brought the group to an exit towards the far end of the hallway, which opened into a flight of stairs that spiraled upwards to a higher level. Stu led the way as the four rodents ascended the stairs. Don shuddered as he took his first step up.
I'm not dreaming, am I?
Elizabeth shook her head.
No, I remember it, too.
"This ain't the Raxus Tower, if that's what y'all are thinking," Stu called back down to them. Elizabeth and Don exchanged uneasy glances, which devolved into stifled laughter. Yes, they had been remembering the tower Elizabeth had imagined in a dream the two had shared many months ago, and the mad warlock who dwelled within. The dark steps were nearly a dead ringer for the obsidian architecture from the dream. The library at the top of the stairs was in a comparable condition to the library below. The circle of shelves had been emptied, their books torn to shreds of paper and leather on the floor. The once grand statue of Jupiter, the father of Peter Dane and Dr. Chuckles, had been defaced and pulled down, with words like liar and hypocrite scratched into its once shiny metal surface. Each of the hidden doors, shelves that swung open to reveal chambers beyond, had been wrenched from their hinges and smashed against the floor. Their fragments bore the marks of savage claws, and judging by the sizes of those marks, Elizabeth could guess what had left them. Yet the most striking part of it all was not the destruction, but the layers of dusts and cobwebs that lay across everything.
This happened ages ago,
Elizabeth observed.
probably right after he killed Jupiter.
Revenge must have ended too fast, Stu added. Elizabeth nodded.
So he destroyed not only the rat, but his legacy.
Elizabeth proceeded with a heavy heart to the far chamber where Jupiter had once kept his network of monitors. She sighed as she saw the 9 screens, each one smashed in.
So much for the plan.
Don winced as he picked up an overturned chair and eased into it with a heavy sigh.
Well, at least we have a safe place to rest.
Yet no sooner had the words left Don's mouth than there came a sound of claws against wood in an adjoining room. Fay held a finger to her lips, gesturing for the others to be quiet, while she softly eased her way to a dark entry that yawned to the left of the stairway. Her ears twitched as she listened for movements, and then, balancing on the balls of her feet, steadying herself with a hand against the door frame, "Wait!" a voice cried out from within. "Don't hurt me! I'm coming out! I'm not armed, see?" A pair of hands emerged from the shadows, palms facing up, empty. And what hands they were, covered in variously colored patches of skin, sewn together with a spiderweb of stitches, spreading along the arms to a pair of slender shoulders, across a chest, back, neck, torso, legs, face. At one time the rat might have been attractive, but as she was... Fay took a step back, grimacing in abject horror.
What happened to you?
The strange rat gulped, her hands shaking. Demon happened.
Who?
Dr. Chuckles.
Elizabeth stepped out of the monitoring station.
It's what the other specimens called him.
The patchwork rat gasped as she laid eyes on Elizabeth. You! Is it really you? The Scarlet Lady? Who will kill Demon once and for all? Elizabeth shook her head slowly, her brow furrowing.
I'm not here to kill anyone, just to save a friend.
Don, however, was starting to chuckle.
Who will? Liz, this is sounding like one of your books. Let me guess. There's a prophecy, right?
The strange rat nodded. In his wanderings, before coming to Olympus, Demon met a seer. She told him he would be slain by a woman in scarlet. Don snapped his fingers.
Lucky guess.
Elizabeth crossed her arms, approaching the rat with a cautious, observant eye.
And if this happened before Dr. Chuckles, or Demon, came here, how did you hear about it?
The rat gulped, blinking. It's very common knowledge. I haven't met a rat yet that hasn't heard the story.
I never heard it.
Fay spoke up. The other rat looked up at her. I don't recognize you.
Before your time, sweetie. Long before.
Elizabeth eyed the patchwork rat for a time longer.
You're the first person that hasn't tried to kill us. You're the first person that hasn't tried to kill us. Who are you?
The rat appeared to settle down for a moment. Just for a moment. I'm called Venus.
Venus.
Don piped up.
That was the Roman goddess of love and beauty, right?
The rat's hands shook as she looked down at them, and her eyes welled with tears. That's just what they call me. The others fell silent for a time as Venus wept. Then it was Stu who broke the ice. We gotta get this girl in a room with Monster, eh?
Hush.
Elizabeth gave the shrew a sharp look. Addressing Venus, she added,
It's only a name. Make it your own.
She offered the rat the edge of her cloak to dry her eyes. Thank you, Venus whispered as she wiped away her tears. Thank you.
In the meantime,
Elizabeth spoke up, glancing between her companions in turn.
each of you find a place to sleep. We're in no shape to face Dr. Chuckles as we are.
I'll take the first watch, Stu volunteered.
You are in the best condition.
Elizabeth nodded.
Oh, sorry. You are in the best... Do it again.
Elizabeth nodded.
You are in the best condition.
Someone better close the door.
Don heaved himself out of his chair.
Just so no one knows we've been here, right?
Faye nodded her agreement and set off on the errand.
I was referring to me.
Don called after her. After a moment's pause, however, he added,
But it's fine if you do it too.
Collapsing into his seat, he heaved a sigh.
I actually prefer it, come to think of it.
Elizabeth drew a chair alongside Don's and settled in gratefully beside him. Anything I can do for y'all? Stu offered, scurrying to Elizabeth's side. She nodded with a low whisper.
Keep a close eye on Venus. If she does anything, bite her.
Stu gulped for a moment, running his tongue across his teeth. Finally, he nodded. I can do that. Yeah. So began the short respite. Faye lingered in the gallery on the lower level, gathering shreds of canvas from the destroyed paintings, with which she bound their many wounds from the previous fights and snares. Venus fidgeted uneasily as the others slept. In time, Faye relieved the shrew, and sent him to rest his weary head. Faye, her eyes narrow and suspicious, took up a position between Stu and Venus, never taking her gaze off the stitched rat. Time ticked by at an agonizing, sluggish pace. Elizabeth took over for Faye, and Don took over for Elizabeth. He lingered near the entrance to the library, his good hand resting on the hilt of a poisoned dagger throughout his watch. Upon waking, Elizabeth found herself stiff and sore. Mercifully, however, she had stopped bleeding. Every inch of her felt weak and spent as she sat up and stretched. Don's condition wasn't much better. He could barely move his left arm without wincing. By far, however, Faye appeared to be in the worst shape of them. Her many wounds from the pendulums had taken a heavy toll. Her arms flopped listlessly as she rolled onto her stomach, and she swayed uneasily as she gained her feet. Stu had been lucky. His small size, usually a detriment, had proven a great defense against the many trials they had faced. He had slipped easily between the pendulums, and had gone unnoticed by the marksmen.
Well,
Elizabeth groaned.
we're back to square one. Where do we go now?
Back to sleep.
Don quipped.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm in no shape to do anything.
Ditto.
Faye announced, wincing in silent agony as she ripped another strip of luxuriant cloth from the lining of her jacket for use as a bandage. Elizabeth sighed, collapsing onto her back.
Well, I won't argue with either of you. Do what you think is right.
Rolling onto her stomach, she struggled to her feet, clinging to a chair for support.
But as for me, Peter's still out there. Every second we waste, his chances get worse. I need to keep going.
Liz, I hate to be a wet blanket.
Don propped himself up on his good elbow, throwing her a skeptical glance.
But going where?
Elizabeth hung her head and sank to her knees.
I haven't a clue. I only remember a corridor or two of this place.
At that, there came a sound of someone clearing their throat from a dark archway. I can help. I've lived here all my life. I know these passages well. Elizabeth raised her head, her ears perking up. She had all but forgotten about Venus.
Do you know where I can find Demon?
He's been building a machine, Venus answered. He spends almost all his time inside it. Find it, and you find him. Elizabeth pursed her lips, but did not turn her head. Her expression would have revealed more than she was comfortable with.
And where did you hear about this machine?
Let me guess.
Don chimed in.
Common knowledge, right?
Venus nodded.
Lucky guess.
Lucky guess.
Lucky guess.
At last Elizabeth turned around.
Can you take me there?
Venus gulped, shifting her weight from one foot to the other and back again. At last she nodded. I'm coming too, Stu announced. Elizabeth gave a weary smile as she looked his way, her eyes glistening and sparkling with irrepressible gratitude.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Don's brow furrowed.
You, over here.
At this, he motioned Stu to his side and pressed a knife into the shrew's hand.
You keep her safe, all right?
Stu nodded.
And press every advantage. You've got venom, right? Use it.
Thus 3 figures of varying size set out, the middle one taking care to close the door behind her as they left. Venus led the way, strangely quick, though whether this was due to eagerness or fear was anyone's guess. Regardless, Elizabeth followed at a slower pace, held back as she was by her sore hip. Stu kept close to Elizabeth, as much for his own protection as out of a sense of loyalty. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them had to. Elizabeth and Stu were thinking the same thing. A simple glance was enough to confirm that. But there was nothing to be done about it. Venus was their only lead. "It's just around this corner," the patchwork rat called back to them.
Remarkably close,
Elizabeth mused. "But it's possible, right?" Stu added. By the look on his face, however, it was clear the shrew didn't believe his own words. Venus had stopped where a second corridor branched off to the right. "Just down here. There's a door hidden on your left. It opens right into Demon's workshop." Elizabeth gazed down the corridor, a suspicious eyebrow raised.
Lead on.
Venus winced. "Do I have to? I can't face Demon again. I just can't." She gently rubbed her stitch-patterned arm, absently as she said it. Elizabeth eyed Venus for a long time. The rat gazed back, silently pleading. Finally, Elizabeth gave in.
Let's go, Stu.
Stu didn't argue. He did note, however, that Elizabeth proceeded especially slowly, examining every inch of wood grain along the way. Anything, absolutely anything, could have been a trigger for another trap. Behind them, Venus watched with a keen interest. Not that far down the corridor, Elizabeth held up a hand, gesturing for Stu to stop. What is it?" Elizabeth pointed at the floor.
Pressure plate. Step carefully.
A line of them ran across the width of the corridor, so close to the texture of the surrounding wood it took the keen eyes of a mouse to spot them. Elizabeth stepped lightly over the panels, lifting Stu after her and setting him down on the other side. Behind them there came a rush of rapid footsteps. A pale form dashed past Elizabeth. A foot struck a panel. A low metallic groan sounded as a pair of rusty hinges dropped shut with a clatter. Venus hit the ground, rolling under the metal arc of the falling gates. Elizabeth gaped at the sudden motion, rushing just too late as the cage fell into place, grabbing and shaking the bars of her collapsible prison in vain. "What happened?" Stu shouted. "Elizabeth, where are these?" There came a sound of gleeful cackling from beyond the bars, and with it a deadly calm settled over Elizabeth.
I saw this coming,
she muttered. Glaring into the gloom beyond, she fixed Venus with an icy look.
I don't suppose you'd care to explain yourself.
"He's going to heal me," Venus answered, leering through the bars. "Going to make me beautiful. He said he would. Said he loves me. I'm the one good thing in his life. That's what he told me. Fools, all of you. Thought I'd betray Remus. Dear Remus. Oh, you'll be happy, so happy, once I've brought him the lady in scarlet." "Let me at her," Stu growled, lunging for the bars. "I'll give her 2 with the hand and 5 across the lip." He bounced harmlessly off, sending a wave rattling through the cage. Venus cackled, endlessly amused by the shrew's rage, and dashed away through the dark. Stu heaved a sigh of frustration and collapsed against the side of the cage. "Well, so much for the big rescue. What do we do now?" Elizabeth's brow furrowed as she peered into the dark.
We test the cage. The last time I was trapped, there was a trick to it.
Elizabeth poked around the sides of the cage and gazed up and down at the seams where each side met. There was a clear pattern, all right, an interlocking sequence of clamps, which had snapped shut when triggered by the beams crashing into them. Yet the releases were too stiff and rusted for Elizabeth's hands to trigger. Stu shook his head and rubbed his eyes. Elizabeth sat down beside him, curling an arm around the shrew's shoulder, and hugged him close. In the dark and stillness, they waited. Venus, meanwhile, dashed madly down the corridor, deftly avoiding every trigger, panel, and even motion detector in her path, for she was intimately familiar with their every location. Somewhere along the line, she pushed a door open and emerged into the flickering light of the ruined ape halls. Venus rushed through crowds of sickly rodents where they variously lay and stood, awaiting some long-promised future. A handful of chemically enhanced surgeons spilled the blood of their brethren as they worked to restore, somewhat, their horrifically deformed subjects. Finally, a handful of armed guards stood aside as Venus approached, and there it stood just beyond. It was gnarled and wrinkled, welded together from metal pipes, rising like a tower of steel brains from the center of a large square chamber. Broken glass littered the floor, the remains of beakers and test tubes thrown down from the high wooden platforms, known to apes as tables and desks. Wires ran from the walls, crackling with energy as they converged at the oval-shaped feet of the structure. It sat upon tank-like treads, which wrapped around metal rollers. Rat and mouse engineers alike moved to and fro in its shadow, sparks flying from superheated metal implements, steel pounding, and rodent-sized engines whining as parts were welded, rivets pounded, and nuts and bolts twisted into place. A large hatch gaped from the front, yawning wide like the gates of a twisted demonic castle. As Venus eagerly scurried inside, she was met with a blast of steam. When her vision cleared, she continued down a short, wide corridor, accompanied by a vast web of copper pipes that snaked along the walls and ceiling. The floor alternately rang with her steps against metal sheets and thudded softly as she stepped across rubber pads. A small, ruddy chamber awaited further in, faintly circular, with 4 passages leading out, one to the main entrance, another leading to a stairway up, a second stairway descending on the opposite side. Straight ahead, there stood a round, sealed door, not unlike that of a bank vault, albeit shrunken down to the scale of a rat. Beads of sweat collected along the surface of Venus' dry, dead skin as the hot, humid air met with the cold leather. She shook with joy as she glanced this way and that. Venus loved venturing into the steel tower at every opportunity. The mechanical sounds reminded her of... "Remus!" Venus exclaimed, as the sounds of whirring and clicking grew suddenly close and loud. And he appeared. The circular, wheel-like lock on the door spun open, and a black form lurched through, metal talons clicking against the copper floor, gears grinding, and hydraulics whining as his prosthetic legs carried him forward. "She's here," Venus announced, quite unable to contain herself with glee. "I trapped her. I did it." Venus was so proud of herself. Surely he would be pleased. Surely he would shower her with praise and pause his work on the machine to continue his work on her. Surely he would reward her. A glittering form moved. A knife-like hand, instinctively stretching forth as if to caress Venus' cheek with its razor edge. But she didn't care. Let it touch her. Let it scrape and cut and make her bleed. Let it sever a stitch and let her skin unravel. Just so long as Remus touched her, if only for a moment. Venus crept forward, reaching out for the hand. She wanted to feel it, to fondle it, to nuzzle it, but it pulled away, and he turned his back on her. The corners of Venus' mouth shuddered and drooped. Remus was silent for a time. Venus' heart pounded as she waited, wondering. Had she done something wrong? Was she intruding? Had she angered him? Oh, she couldn't bear to imagine upsetting dear Remus. "Where?" Venus jumped at the sound of his sudden voice. Her words caught in her throat. "Is the lady still alive?" Venus nodded. "Then release her and bring her here." Venus gulped.
Remus, I'm vulnerable. If she cut me...
"She won't, nor will she run away. She wants to find me." His piece spoken, Remus held up his hand, as if contemplating the thing. Venus turned away, quite taken aback at Remus' response. She threw many curious glances over her shoulder as she slunk away. Then Remus struck his hand against a pipe. A blast of steam gushed forth from the ruptured conduit with a piercing whistle. Venus, shocked into motion, scampered away without another thought. When she returned to her captives, Venus was visibly shaken. Gone was the gleeful cackle, the triumphant swagger. She had reverted to the timid creature Elizabeth encountered in Jupiter's wrecked lair. "Y'all still ain't beautiful," Stu observed. Elizabeth gave the shrew a warning nudge in the side, followed with a faint shake of her head. "He told me to bring you to him," Venus answered, a bitter edge to her voice. She hesitated beside a panel in the wall. "He said you wouldn't hurt me." Glancing back towards her captives, Venus added, "Will you?" Elizabeth shook her head. Stu, however, did not. "Why shouldn't we?" Elizabeth restrained the shrew with a firm hand on his shoulder.
We won't. I promise.
Stu frowned as he glanced up at Elizabeth, but didn't argue the matter. He did, however, remark, "And right now, her word's worth a lot more than yours." Venus gulped, pressing a hand against the panel. Chains rattled, gears groaned into motion, and the metal gates rose, opening the passage once more. Elizabeth tightened her grip on Stu's shoulder, just in case, drawing a light wince from the shrew. She was tempted to say something like, "You didn't have to do this," or "You gained nothing by betraying us," but she bit her tongue and simply said,
"Lead on."
As the trio emerged into the open halls of the great apes, Elizabeth was dumbstruck at the sight of the creatures around her. She knew the apes had many victims, and that they had performed horrific experiments upon the lab specimens, but up until now she had only seen Peter, Dr. Chuckles, and Jupiter, and now Venus. She had never imagined the throng awaiting her. There were all manner of deformities, twisted limbs, misshapen bodies and faces, body parts growing where there should have been none, empty space where others should have been, empty faces of inbred and brain-dead and brain-damaged subjects drooling mindlessly. And, of course, there were the enhanced surgeons, working to ease the suffering of their charges. Venus took note of the look of horror on Elizabeth's face. "They're Remus' work, you know, the ones trying to undo the apes' damage. They were the first thing he did when he set us free. He took a handful of loyal followers and set them about healing the rest of us." Elizabeth nodded. For some odd reason, she wasn't at all surprised. For some odd reason, it felt like the kind of thing Dr. Chuckles would do. What did shock her, however, was what loomed ahead when Venus led her past the armed guards. The dark tower, steam issuing from its every orifice. It was as if the Tower of Thraxis had been lifted directly from Elizabeth's dream and set before her here in real life. Stu hesitated at the entrance, his little round glasses fogging up as he peered into the steaming opening. "I don't know about this. I say Pete's probably dead already. Let's go back." Venus grinned at the shrew's discomfort.
Until we confirm it, there's still a chance,
Elizabeth retorted. With that said, however, she added,
"But I would prefer if you waited out here."
Despite his fear, Stu bristled at the suggestion. "What, and leave y'all to face that fiend alone? No way! I'm coming, Lisbeth!" Down into the alley of the shadow of death Venus led them. Electricity crackled along metal cables, surging along lines that converged upon the metal tower. As Elizabeth approached the yawning entrance, she was met with a strong coppery scent and a rush of hot, humid air. She passed down the short, vapor-shrouded corridor, Stu creeping along at her heels. Venus brought up the rear, preventing either of them from fleeing. Elizabeth took note of the pipes running alongside them, as well as the occasional rubber pad on the floor. Entering the central chamber, Elizabeth was immediately struck by the similarities to her dream. All that was missing was the banquet table. Her stomach growled at the thought, sending a vast, thunderous rumble reverberating through the copper corridors. As if in answer, there arose the sounds of humming and whirring from beneath her feet. Then it drifted to the right and began to rise. A mass of fur, bloated pustules, and robotic limbs crawled through the entrance on the right, a single reddish eye peering from under a black fedora, and a monocle-like lens glinting from amidst the mass of tumors that made up the malformed left half of his face. Elizabeth held her voice firm, despite the pounding of her heart as she nodded in greeting.
Remus.
Dr. Chuckles cocked his head to the side, his normally menacing grin taking on an edge of genuine pleasure at the sound of his birth name. He bowed, with a sweep of one skeletal, blade-like arm. "Dear Lady Elizabeth, welcome back." "Welcome?" Venus repeated, somewhat indignant. "Of course." Dr. Chuckles crossed his arms behind his back and lurched aside, circling around his visitors. "It's been a very long time since we matched wits, and after our last encounter I have been so looking forward to a rematch." Elizabeth flinched as she remembered. Dr. Chuckles had trapped her in a complex cage, which, surprisingly, she had managed to escape unaided. She wasn't eager for a repeat performance.
Where's Peter?
"Ah, yes." Dr. Chuckles nodded towards the door he had just vacated. "The object of our little game. You'll find him in the engine room below. Don't worry, he's quite alive. For now."
May I see him?
Elizabeth asked.
Before we, begin?
Dr. Chuckles leaned close, regarding the little mouse for a time with his real eye. After a moment, he smirked and nodded. "You may, of course." Stu scurried after Elizabeth as she descended the winding stairway, casting many a wary glance behind him at the form of Dr. Chuckles as the rat followed them down. A ridge of growths lifted, not unlike a curious eyebrow, as Dr. Chuckles took note of the expression on Stu's face. Dark, yellowed teeth flashed as he grinned down at the shrew. Between the steps, Elizabeth caught glances of a giant metal axle, and between, a cube-shaped array of pipes and circuits. At the bottom of the stairs, Dr. Chuckles strode past, energy crackling from his presence alone. It made Elizabeth's fur stand on end. He traced his metal talons through a series of locks at the front of the engine, and pulled twin panels open. Light flickered, and electricity surged within, and screams issued from inside. Before they had been muffled, barely distinguishable from the sound of machinery, but now they were quite clear. The doctor chuckled softly at the look of horror spreading across Elizabeth's face. "You wanted to see him?" He motioned to the opening. "Here he is. Look." Elizabeth gulped, but she did step forward. Inside she saw Peter. Each of his hands was held fast in a metal clamp, electricity flowing through them into vast networks of wires on either side. Peter didn't appear to be aware of her, or any other part of his surroundings for that matter, as he twisted this way and that, occasionally panting for breath before the pain became too much and his screams ripped forth once more. "It really isn't that bad," Dr. Chuckles mused. "At least it wasn't for me."
Let him out!
Elizabeth pleaded.
Please.
"It isn't my fault he's unaccustomed to pain. Oh, look, even now, his cries are growing softer." Elizabeth certainly didn't notice. As she gazed, horrified at the scene, she felt herself creeping forward. She wasn't sure how, but she needed to get Peter out of there. Dr. Chuckles exclaimed, grabbing Elizabeth roughly by the shoulder. "I need him. As a battery, you might say. I had planned to power the machine myself, but then my dear brother made an offer I simply couldn't refuse." Elizabeth barely heard the rat's words. Instead, her attention was drawn to the details, the designs of the clamps, the shape of Peter's metal bonds, and most importantly, the weak spots. She noted the screws connecting the halves of the clamps and the devices by which they were fastened in place. Elizabeth stopped struggling. "Now, step back," Dr. Chuckles added. "I wouldn't want you to get caught in the current."
No,
Elizabeth agreed.
of course not.
She was answered with a chuckle. "You have a plan already, don't you?"
Plan?
Elizabeth repeated, quite innocently. "Of course." Dr. Chuckles nudged her in the side, ushering Elizabeth toward the stairs. "You've calmed considerably. Either you have a plan, or your friend's suffering means very little to you. Well, let's see you plan your way around this." Dr. Chuckles closed the panels and fastened the various locks back into place. The sounds of screaming faded back into the hum of machinery and the sizzling of static. Dr. Chuckles threw a glance over his shoulder, a sly smirk tugging at the loose, healthy half of his face. "I challenge you to plan your way past this. A little puzzle, if you can manage to reach it."
You should be better than this.
Dr. Chuckles shrugged. "I know. It isn't much of a puzzle, but it's the best I could manage on short notice."
That isn't what I meant. I've seen you, the real you.
Metal crashed against metal as Dr. Chuckles lurched towards Elizabeth. "Have you really? And who am I, my lady?" It had only ever been a guess, yet with her bluff called, Elizabeth had no choice but to stay her course. Her confidence shaken, Elizabeth pressed forward.
You're a lonely, broken heart. A good man that let himself be twisted into...
Elizabeth paused, weighing her words. The only one that fit was a former name of the mad rat.
a demon.
The rat chuckled for a moment and looked away. "I was lonely, yes. No longer. I've made some friends recently, as I'm sure you saw." Yet he fell silent for a time. Elizabeth could see a glimmer of doubt in his eye. Elizabeth slowly shook her head, never taking her eyes off the looming rat.
What could you hope to accomplish with all this?
Dr. Chuckles' skin cracked. Blood trickled from scabs as they split open, his misshapen face twisting as his grin returned in force. "I thought you'd never ask." Stu scurried aside as Dr. Chuckles strode back to the front of the engine. The rat paused to compose himself, and then turned to leer down at Elizabeth. "Behold, Project Tartarus, my answer to Olympia, the source of all my troubles. These chimpanzees sought to claim divinity through mortal means, their precious science. And like Babel of old, they caused only their downfall." Dr. Chuckles spread his arms with a mechanical whine. "Me! And now I have taken their curse and turned it back on them. I have created a virus to rob them of their minds, steal away their logic and reason. Then, having been reduced to mindless beasts, then finally they die. I think that's far more merciful than what they did to me, don't you?" Elizabeth glanced to the engine, the faint cries returning to her ears.
Peter didn't do this to you, Remus. When he left you, he was every bit as heartbroken and lost as you were.
Dr. Chuckles grunted, leaning against the side of the engine. "Odd. I didn't see him twitching on the ground, every nerve in his body burning, while his only friend turned his back on him."
Let him go.
"No." Dr. Chuckles lurched away from the engine, his steel talons crashing against the copper floor. "This discussion is over. Let the game begin." His tail rattled in anticipation, and his hands spread into broad, razor circles.
Stu, behind me!
Elizabeth shouted. Her heart skipped a beat as Dr. Chuckles advanced on her. Yet she noticed he wasn't pressing his greatest advantage. In addition to his enhanced intelligence, Dr. Chuckles, like Peter, could also give off a charge of bioelectricity, and the three of them were in a structure of solid copper. The answer stood at the top of the stairs, looking down with an expression of manic glee on the spectacle. Elizabeth ushered Stu toward the lower steps, mind racing as she thought of ways to keep Dr. Chuckles talking.
You wouldn't hurt me, would you? You never did before.
Before was a warm-up, Dr. Chuckles answered. He took a warning swipe at Elizabeth, as if to drive the point home. Several talons whizzed across the top of her head, taking off the tips of her bangs. This is the true contest of minds. Elizabeth stumbled, falling against the steps as she ducked under another swipe.
For one obsessed with the mind, I've yet to see you use yours.
She scurried higher, sparks flying at her heels, as she just narrowly avoided a second slash of the rat's claws.
So far, all I've seen is brute force.
I must admit, you disappoint me as well, Dr. Chuckles remarked, as he continued his slow advance up the stairs. Begging me to simply let you win. Where's the fun in that? Stu leapt to Elizabeth's defense, stabbing Dr. Chuckles in the stomach and following up with a bite before darting back to Elizabeth's side. The rat didn't even flinch. I admire your courage, little man, but did you really think that would affect me? I, who learned to live with debilitating agony every moment of every accursed day long ago? Yet even as he said it, Dr. Chuckles hesitated, glancing down at the bite and raising a curious eyebrow.
Come, Stu.
Elizabeth urged, taking the shrew by the hand.
To the top.
Dr. Chuckles looked up, smirking at the fleeing forms. I believe I'll keep your friend alive, for research. I find him intriguing. At the top of the stairs, Venus let out a cackle, spreading her arms as she bent low to block Elizabeth's retreat. Yet the glee in her eyes fast turned to horror as Elizabeth slipped a hand under her cloak, emerging with a silver flash. Remus! A terrified shriek split the air. Dr. Chuckles' eyes widened, all amusement vanishing from his face. He dashed up the stairs as quickly as his prosthetic limbs could carry him. He didn't even notice Elizabeth and Stu as he scrambled past them, didn't see them scampering across the top of the engine. All he saw in that moment were the severed stitches as the patchwork of skin grafts covering Venus began to unravel. Remus, help me! Venus fumbled in a panic, struggling to hold her skin together as large patches fell away, revealing red, pulsing muscle and veins underneath. Dr. Chuckles caught up the loose flesh as best he could, but his razor talons cut through even more stitches, sending broad patches of skin fluttering to the ground. He roared with a blend of fury and terror. Morden! Bring me thread! Guards, anyone! I need thread! With Dr. Chuckles briefly distracted, Elizabeth set about the task of opening the engine chamber. She peered down at the network of latches and locks from a perch atop the engine, and then glanced to Stu.
I need your knife.
The shrew obeyed, passing his small weapon to Elizabeth without question. Using a technique she had often read about, but never actually employed herself, Elizabeth jammed the blade between the twin doors and slowly rappelled down the side of the engine. It did not work as advertised, possibly due to the use of a knife rather than a plastic card, but the locks did rattle and shake when struck with the blade, revealing the pattern needed to solve the code. By the time Elizabeth reached the bottom, the twin panels swung open, revealing the twitching, sizzling prisoner within. Elizabeth gulped for a moment as she considered how to open the two electrified clamps. Swallowing her fear, she approached the nearest one and recoiled involuntarily as a powerful current surged into her hands. Taking a breath, she removed her cloak and, wrapping it around her hands, attempted the task a second time. Smoke wafted from her cloak as the electric current burned into it. Elizabeth hastily worked the clamp, spinning the handle free as quickly as she could manage. Peter slumped to the floor as his hand slipped free, and the engine ground to a halt, the circuit having been broken. The remaining clamp loosened far more easily. Peter gasped for breath, his eyes glassy and dazed as he dropped to his side. His tongue lolled listlessly out the side of his mouth as his blank eyes stared, unblinking in either direction, a line of drool running from the side of his mouth.
Peter?
Elizabeth whispered, nudging the rat's shoulder. With no answer forthcoming, she called him by his birth name.
Romulus. Romulus.
Peter's eye drifted in Elizabeth's direction, and very faintly the beginnings of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. A faint gurgle rose from his throat, but he said nothing.
Can you walk?
It was a silly question. Peter panted as if trying to laugh. He at least had the presence of mind to pull his tongue in as he closed his mouth. His arm flopped about as he attempted to wipe the drool from his mouth. Elizabeth offered him the edge of her cloak. "Hey, Elizabeth," Stu called down. "Ain't no time to waste. Old Doc Chuck's still here, remember? And he's gonna be mad when he pulls his lady together." Elizabeth gulped as she recalled her surroundings and heard the sounds of shouting on the floor above. She looked down at Peter and heaved against his arms, struggling to pull him into a sitting position.
Peter! Romulus! Whoever you are! I know you've suffered agony beyond imagining, and I know it's left you weak, but I can't carry you. Please, if you have any strength left in you, help me help you.
Elizabeth felt the muscle grow tense and hard under her grasp as Peter's hand spread flat against the floor. He rose higher as his limbs flopped, flailed, and finally coiled beneath him. Some of the former intelligence returned to Peter's eyes as he drank in his surroundings.
Can you walk?
Elizabeth asked. I can run. Peter was off like a shot, rushing up the stairs. Elizabeth scurried after him, joined by Stu as they passed. Peter rammed into Dr. Chuckles' back, shoving him aside as he dashed by. The rat cyborg fell to his hands and knees, looking over his shoulder just in time to see Elizabeth hot on Peter's heels. Saul Morden, who had arrived just moments before, drew a pistol and fired off 3 shots. "That's enough!" Dr. Chuckles roared, foam streaming from his mouth. Morden gave Dr. Chuckles a look of confusion. "You're getting away!" He was answered with 5 metal talons clamped around his torso, in a ready kill position. "I didn't tell you to capture anyone. I called for thread!" Peter, meanwhile, emerged from the metal tower, shielding his eyes with one arm against the blinding light outside. The checkered tiles, combined with the shocked stares of mice and rats around him, left Peter dizzy and disoriented. He could feel the room beginning to spin.
Peter!
Elizabeth's voice drew him back to the moment, with an urgent tug on his sleeve.
This way!
Barely aware of what he was doing, Peter staggered after Elizabeth. Shocked cries went up all around him as his seared, ragged form lurched through crowds of lab specimens.
Over here!
The light faded as Peter hurtled after Elizabeth's voice, plunging him into darkness.
Careful of the floor. It triggers a cage.
Elizabeth heaved Peter's foot high, then darted back to the other, helping him to avoid the wooden panels that had ensnared her on the way in. Elizabeth paused at the crossroad of the passages in the walls, lifting an ear to listen. Much to her surprise, there was no sound of pursuit. This was because her diversion had struck a far deeper chord than Elizabeth could have dreamed. At that moment, Venus lay on an operating table, hastily erected, just outside the tower. Dr. Chuckles, scowling angrily, looped his recently acquired thread through a specially designed talon and set about his work stitching together pieces of skin. Disappointing. "I'm sorry," Venus panted. "Quiet. Please forgive me if I hadn't been there. I'm trying to concentrate." Venus gulped and closed her eyes. She couldn't bear to gaze on her exposed flesh a moment longer. "It would appear I overestimated her," Dr. Chuckles spoke as he worked. "I had thought she was above harming an innocent bystander." Dr. Chuckles' brow furrowed at the thought. "Mr. Morden." The bounty hunter drew up behind Dr. Chuckles, his Stetson hat slightly askew, and his head cocked to the side as he awaited orders. "I want you to find Riley Nelson and bring him here." "Any particular reason?" "I have a task for him, or I will soon." Glowering over his shoulder, Dr. Chuckles added, "That's all. Go now." It wasn't that long afterwards that Elizabeth and her friends returned to the trashed apartment where she had left Dawn and Fay. Peter shuddered as he recognized the door to Jupiter's lair.
It's okay.
Elizabeth assured him.
I don't think anyone's been here for ages.
Except Venus, Stu pointed out. Peter shook his head wearily. Then we can't stay long. Pity. I rather would have liked a rest. The tortures he suffered had taken a toll on him, and it showed. No sooner had Peter entered the Hall of Paintings than he slumped against a wall with a heavy sigh. Elizabeth set a hand on the rat's arm, forcing the most encouraging nod she could manage.
Wait here. I'll get the others.
To Stu she added.
Stay with him, okay?
Stu nodded. With that, Elizabeth started up the stairway into what had once been the library above. A short time later she returned, accompanied by two other figures. The tallest of the three stopped for a moment as she laid eyes on Peter. Then in a rush, Fay fell upon him, showering Peter with tears of joy as she embraced him and kissed him over and over. Yet the joy of the reunion was cut short when Peter, his eyes widening in panic, asked the grave question. I say, where is Matrix? A heavy silence fell over the room. He did come with you, correct? Fay gave Elizabeth a concerned look. Elizabeth took a deep breath and answered.
We were separated.
Peter clawed his way up the wall, rising straighter. Where? It was on our way in, Stu explained. In the room with all the cages. Then we must return there, Peter stated, staggering for the door.
Already?
Fay exclaimed.
You just got back.
Indeed, Peter nodded. But one of our number is still missing.
And we still can't stay here.
Elizabeth added.
Venus betrayed us. It's only a matter of time before Dr. Chuckles comes sniffing around.
Don snapped his fingers.
Figures. What are we waiting for? Let's blow this joint.
It was slow but hasty going as they left. All of them had been weakened by one trial or another, whether the fight on the way in or the cruelty of Dr. Chuckles. All of them, that is, except for Stu. The lively little shrew ran circles around the others, scouting ahead one moment and then retreating to check for signs of pursuit. Before long, they came to the door leading into the chamber of cages. Stu peered out first, and concluding that the coast was clear, he motioned for the others to follow. Just keep real quiet, he cautioned. There's still guards outside. Stu ran his knife between his teeth as he spoke, letting drops of his venom wash over the blade. The shrew was the first out, scurrying back and forth for a time. Elizabeth almost laughed. A soft breath escaped her as a faint smile forced itself across her face.
What are you doing?
Securing the persimmonitor, Elizabeth.
You mean perimeter?
Stu froze for a moment. Ain't that what I just said? As Peter emerged from the doorway, a shadow leapt from the wall with a loud squeal. Ah! Ah! It landed firmly on Peter's chest and buried its face in the remains of his jacket. Matrix, lad, Peter whispered, his face lighting up at the sight of his faithful companion. Oh, it's so good to see you again. Quite splendid. The rat took the spider in his arms and whirled about in a stiff, awkward, happy dance at his reunion.
We're back together then. Wonderful.
Don whispered.
Now what?
We find a way out,
Elizabeth answered. Looking up to the open vent in the ceiling, she added,
and I think I know the way.
Peter's joy faded as he followed her gaze. Matrix, however, just let out a squeak and held up a coil of silvery silk rope. Elizabeth looked at Don.
Think your arm's up to this?
Don took a deep breath as he stared up the sides of the cages.
Maybe.
He flexed his injured arm a few times, testing its strength.
Only one way to find out.
Elizabeth leaned over to Matrix and whispered something to the spider. She was answered with an eager, "Aha! Aha!" Matrix scurried over Peter's chest, and taking up a perch on his shoulder, wove one end of the rope into a curious bundle of loops, which the spider tossed to Elizabeth. Then he leapt to the bottom of the cage and scuttled straight for the top, the length of the rope trailing behind.
What was that about?
Don murmured.
This.
Elizabeth answered.
Just hold on a moment.
She set about fastening the harness first around her waist and then around Don's arms and legs. Drawing it tight, Elizabeth pulled herself and Don close and firm.
Wow, Liz, I never figured you the type.
Elizabeth allowed herself a shy giggle.
Time can change a person.
So I see.
Uh-oh! Matrix called down from the top of the cages. Elizabeth nodded to Peter.
You first.
Peter gulped, staring at his blackened hands. They shook like leaves in a storm. Peter squeezed his eyes shut, clenching his fists, and took a deep breath. Then he wrapped a length of rope around his left hand. He began the long climb up. Fay followed shortly after, Stu riding in her jacket pocket. Elizabeth and Don were the last, helped by the combined efforts of the others as they pulled the two mice to the top. From there, Peter led the way into the vents. As a precaution, he fastened the rope around his waist and encouraged the others to follow suit. Should the apes' climate control kick in, we should be able to stop anyone from being blown away. Yet as the company ventured into those aluminum tunnels, they found the air to be still and stale. As Peter approached the location of Dr. Chuckles' former workshop, he found the side of the wall that had once protected it from the great ape's violent winds had been torn away entirely. They must have shut the system down, Peter guessed. Venturing inside, Peter found the lab in good working condition. It was, in fact, cleaner than he recalled, the collections of spare parts and surgical tools neatly sorted by the copper-stained operating table in the center of the room. But there was more. A desk. A recent addition, it appeared, sat to one side, a journal laying open on its surface. Curious, in spite of himself, Peter couldn't help perusing the open pages, if only for a moment.
Excuse me,
Stu spoke up.
Ain't we supposed to be, getting out of here?
What is it?
Elizabeth asked. Growing tissues. Peter looked up. Skin, in particular. It would appear my brother has taken an interest in rebuilding missing and damaged body parts. Don and Elizabeth locked eyes and spoke the name almost simultaneously.
Venus.
Possibly, Peter mused. Or, I think this likelier, perhaps he was using her as a guinea pig until he perfected a formula by which he could finally restore his own body. Just then there came the sound of voices from the direction Elizabeth and the others had just come. One of them vibrated with suppressed, mirthless laughter.
Out the other side,
Elizabeth whispered. She found no argument. In fact, the only resistance came from Stu, and that was only when Peter insisted on lingering out of sight to eavesdrop on the newcomers. However, even the shrew knew better than to put up a fight once they drew into earshot.
Something wrong, boss?
There was a short pause, and a rustling of pages.
No, nothing wrong. For a moment it looked as if
the voice of Dr. Chuckles fell silent.
There's nothing.
Peter peered around the corner and saw the towering form of his brother looming over the operating table. There was a light tap of metal talons against glass, and then the mad lab rat spoke again.
You see this, Mr. Nelson?
His companion, a small mouse wearing a large pair of glasses, nodded.
And you know what to do with it?
I slip it between your lady's patches of skin and squirt a bit. The equivalent of 2 lines, Dr. Chuckles added. One behind her shoulders, once on her forehead, and once in her navel. Then I wait a day and cut off her old skin, right?
And a new living layer should have grown in its place underneath. Correct.
There was a short pause.
Boss, you know I'd do anything for you, right? So I don't mean any disrespect, right? If I ask, why don't you do this yourself?
There was no answer.
It just sounds like you won't be there. You'll be there, right, boss?
Of course.
But I have much I need to do first. This is why I need you to proceed without me. Take Venus to the Hollow. I want to see her healthy when I arrive, and ready to begin the next phase.
Peter saw Dr. Chuckles' silhouette bend toward the floor. A moment later, the mouse scurried for the far exit. Once Mr. Nelson's footsteps had faded into nothing, the rat's shoulders shuddered as his laughter began again. Hollow, mirthless, bordering on a cry. Then it rose into a scream, and with a great heave of a metal arm, he sent the operating table flying. He doubled over, wailing, his jaws split painfully wide, his sides bleeding as his metal arms curled and tightened across his heaving diaphragm. Peter pulled back and motioned for the others to continue on their way. He took the lead, navigating through the air vents. In short order, the crew arrived at a vertical shaft. On the opposite side, Peter recognized the rips and gouges in the metal, where Dr. Chuckles had once climbed after them in hot pursuit. It was a chilling memory, but at the very least it meant there were handholds this time. Peter backed away from the edge, and taking a running leap, plunged across the abyss. The edge of the metal dug into his fingers as Peter grabbed on. He climbed up several steps, and then motioned for Fay to follow. She winced as she crashed into the side of the shaft, but managed to maintain a hold. Thus, little by little, the team ascended. Peter, followed by Fay and Stu, with Elizabeth and Dawn dangling by their harness in the rear. They emerged from an air vent on the building's roof, under an angry red sky. Peter untied himself, and then scurried to one side of the roof, and then to another, surveying the landscape. He wore an especially grim expression as he returned to the others. "Where did you hide the scale?" Elizabeth pointed towards an alley across the east street.
Behind some garbage bags.
Peter looked down to the street below, nodding. "Matrix, lad." The spider appeared on his shoulder. "Uh-huh." "Die off this end," Peter ordered, holding up his end of the rope. Matrix nodded, fastening a loop around a bar crossing a nearby vent. "Now, everyone, untie yourselves, except you two." At this, Peter gestured to Dawn and Elizabeth. "We'll lower you down first." Thus the group proceeded. Fay descended next, followed by Stu. "Leave the rope," Peter told Matrix. With that, he rappelled over the side, and down to the ground far below. Matrix shrugged and obeyed. From there, it was a short trip back to the scale. With no vehicles traveling the road, the rodents were free to proceed at their own pace, often resting when Dawn or Fay grew tired. Elizabeth, by contrast, could barely comprehend relaxing until the group had returned to the scale. As her adrenaline rush wore off, she found her limbs growing stiff and sore. She noticed her wounds again and felt the pain that had been numbed for so long. Peter was the odd man out. While the others fell into a weary sleep, he kept watch, standing alert and ready to raise the alarm if anything should happen. His gaze remained fixed on the lab, burning in its intensity, as if to melt through the walls themselves. His knuckles grew white as his fingers tightened about the mast. Despite everything he had been through, Peter was bouncing back, and he was far from finished with his brother.